It started with a postcard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another coupon. Another glossy reminder of someone trying to sell me something. But the postcard was addressed to me, and the return address was from my bank. I opened it, read the notice, and then did what most people do. I tucked it on the kitchen counter and got on with my day. 3 days later, I learned it had never arrived. My neighbor, a woman named Karen who also sat on the HOA board, had been intercepting my mail. I didn't find out because the bank called. I found out because Karen dropped by my house, smiling that particular smile she reserves for people she thinks she's already won against. She handed me a letter and said, casually, "I found this in my mailbox. Thought you might want it." I remember the way her fingers lingered on the paper, like she had known it had been mine before she bothered to look. When I asked how she'd gotten my mail, she shrugged. Simple mistake. Mailboxes get mixed sometime. Don't worry about it. Not worry about it. Those 3 words rang like nails. From that point, little things started to stack up. Packages would appear days late. Important bills would go missing, only to turn up folded in her car when she left them in the neighborhood drop-off pile. A gift I was waiting for arrived with the shipping label peeled and reattached, as if someone had decided to edit the recipient. I took the polite route at first. I wrote an email to the HOA. I asked the postal inspector for advice. I installed a cheap camera in the porch light. The HOA investigated and reported back in careful, bureaucratic language that nothing untoward had been observed. My porch camera had been conveniently offline whenever deliveries came. The postal inspector told me to be patient. Patience is a dangerous thing when you're watching someone take pieces of your life and hand them back to you with a smile. One Saturday, I woke up to a flurry of knock-knock emails from people I only knew, because it left me a ledger of complaints. My mail was the latest entry on a long list of neighborhood grievances about Karen. She had a habit of checking in on community boxes and organizing things for convenience. The more I learned, the more obvious it became. Karen had decided whose mail would make it past her and whose would not. Confrontation felt like walking into a storm with no shelter. She was persuasive, a master of small, piercing lies that left you apologizing for your anger. She'd been on the HOA board for years, convinced that rules existed so they could be enforced by people like her. Every time I thought about taking her on in court or petitioning her removal, I saw her standing at the podium, leaning into the microphone with that same easy, conniving smile. So I planned something quieter. Not violent. Not illegal. Just a jolt, something that would make her stop and think, and that would rely on the one thing she trusted more than the rules, her own sense of entitlement. I put a mousetrap in the mailbox. I say mousetrap, but what I placed inside was a little more like a prank than a weapon. It had been in my attic from an old kit, the kind you buy at a hardware store for pennies. I didn't modify it. I didn't screw it to a board or rig it to anything else. I set it so that when anyone opened the mailbox wide enough to reach their hand in, it would snap shut with enough force to startle and maybe produce a bruise if they were unlucky. That was the end of the technical part of the story, and I'll not go. The next Tuesday, true to form, Karen dropped by. She had on her HOA badge and a routed sense of mission. I noticed a misdelivered package she announced at my gate. Thought I'd help. She had a habit of saying help when she was helping herself. The neighborhood seemed to have collectively decided that Karen's version of help was its default setting, like bad weather that could be predicted. I watched her walk to the cluster box. Watched the way she handled the lid, light crook in her fingers, like a captain checking a ship's log. My heart beat quicker than I expected. There is a particular, childish thrill in watching someone's own armor get tested by their reflection. When she opened the box, the trap snapped. Not a violent, bone-crunching sound, more a sharp pop and a hiss of surprised breath. Karen yelped and jerked her hand back. For a second, she stood frozen, the painted composure cracking into something raw and immediate. Jesus. She spat, more shocked than hurt. Her palm was red where the snap had met it, like a hand that had been lightly smacked. She looked at me with a confusion that was almost genuine. For a moment, she seemed to search for a narrative that could absorb this interruption. "What the hell is that?" she demanded. I stepped forward. My hands were steady. I didn't mock her. I didn't celebrate pain. I let the silence speak. People like Karen are made to be uncomfortable by silence. They crave the chance to fill it with excuses, with reasons that turn tablecloths of truth into origami. I thought it was time someone reminded you that other people have lives, I said. Maybe, next time don't take mail that isn't yours. Karen's face tightened. She looked around as if to find a camera or a witness. The neighborhood had watched our exchanges over the months, the way a jury watches a trial, curious, simmering. She had built a shield of social capital that allowed her to do things and name them for the community. The trap had not been about harming her. It had been about piercing that shield for 3 beats, long enough for her to feel what other people felt when she reached into their boxes. She pulled her hand back. Not because she hurt, but because she was humiliated. Her composure, which is like a practiced garment to her, would take time to mend. That was the point. But that short blast of shock set off more than I expected. Word traveled fast in the cul-de-sac. Someone had seen her yelp. Someone else had seen her limp away with her palm tucked to her chest. Rumors spread with the velocity of small-town gossip. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen showed up with a bandage and a story about an accident, a fumbled key, a paper cut, who knows. The kind of story that asks for sympathy and gives little away. It should have been the end of it. Instead, the trap began a cascade. The postal inspector took an interest after residents started to ask direct questions. Cameras around the neighborhood, finally reviewed with genuine attention, revealed patterns that were too consistent to be coincidence. Packages and envelopes routed through common hands appeared in odd places, and in the digital breadcrumb trail, Karen's name showed as a recurring node. The inspector had stories of habit. People who get used to accessing things not theirs because of convenience or control. Once the T, Karen found herself under scrutiny the way a streetlight finds a moth. Her friends on the HOA became less quick with their smiles. People who had once deferred to her now found the courage to speak up. The board voted to review the mail policies, and a neighborhood petition sought to limit the number of times any board member could check the drop boxes. I never intended for her to be prosecuted. I never wanted a criminal record listed beside her name, or for any harm to follow. That night, as I sat on my porch and watched the stars blink like distant witnesses, I wanted her to understand what a little theft felt like. I wanted her to lose the ease of entitlement that let her believe she owned other people's lives. The aftermath was messy. Karen called me at midnight, voice brittle with indignation and fear. "You set me up," she whispered. You did something to humiliate me. I set a reminder, I replied, honest to my own ethics. A reminder that other people are not props in your life. She tried to dial a story that would turn public opinion back in her favor. It was all a misunderstanding. She had only meant to organize. She was under a lot of stress. Many believed her at first. Social capital is a powerful medicine. But the records, the witnesses, the quiet notes of people who had been pushed aside for years, they told another truth. In the weeks that followed, Karen's hold loosened. She had once been the unclimbable hill of authority on our street. Now she was a hill with a dent. People stopped answering her calls the way they used to. Packages went to mailboxes with better locks and fewer excuses. The HOA policies changed, and with them came a small, significant reprieve for the mail the neighborhood had always assumed would belong to the loudest voice. There was no gloating from me. I felt only a complicated relief, the kind that comes from taking a stand without becoming the person you're standing against. Justice, when it is not fire and blood, is a slow untangling. Sometimes it begins with a snap. Months later, Karen moved. The notice appeared on a Friday, crisp and clinical, like the rest of her life when she chose to formalize it. She'd been voted off a committee, lost a seat she'd built a little throne from, and, in the end, she decided to find pastures where fewer people remembered the details. When she packed her last box, she left a note on her front door. It was stiff with apology and an odd, almost self-aware humility. "I'm sorry for any distress I caused," the note read. For once, the words were short and sincere. I never felt pride as much as I felt the quiet satisfaction. Not vindictive, not a horror movie sort of delight in watching another suffer, but a human contentment that comes when the scales begin to correct themselves. It was a lesson in boundaries, and in the way small acts can mean a lot. The mail started arriving on time again. People stopped explaining away the little thievish things that had become neighborhood habit. We installed better locks and a clearer policy. The camera that had once been conveniently offline was now a small town guardian, its blinking red light a reminder that someone was paying attention. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about the decision to use a trap at all. Would I do it again? Maybe not. The world is messy. The difference between justice and revenge can be a line that blurs dangerously without you realizing. But in the end, the trap didn't break a bone or destroy a life. It broke a pattern. And in a place where entitlement had carved the rules into jagged edges, a small, loud snap was enough to remind people that rules exist to protect the quiet majority, not to amplify the loudest few. If you ask me for a moral, I'd say this: escalate wisely, protect your dignity, choose remedies that fix the problem without becoming the problem. And if you ever lose something you're sure should have been there, check the obvious place first, the mailbox, but also check who thinks they have the right to open it. After everything settled, I found myself paying more attention to other small injustices that quietly shaped our days. People share neighborhoods, but they also share histories of being overlooked. The elderly, whose packages vanish, the young mothers whose coupons get co-opted by someone else's convenience, the small business owners whose invoices were misplaced until they stopped asking. Once the neighborhood's trust map was redrawn, little stories started to surface: a man who had a habit of borrowing things from the common shed and never returning them, a teenager who always checked on the lost and found as if she had first dibs, neighbors who excused small disappearances because it was easier than confronting someone who always seemed to have the right reason. We formed a small committee, nothing official or vindictive, just a rotating group of neighbors who agreed to check in on communal spaces. We drafted clear language about access to the mailboxes, who could touch them, and what counted as an emergency. We reminded people, gently, sometimes not so gently, that convenience was not permission. People liked the change because it removed the fog of assumption. Either you had the right to do something, or you didn't. There were awkward moments. Karen would still stand outside her new rental sometimes and watch the block like a general surveying a battlefield she believed she'd won. Once, she came over and handed me a cake, too neat, too apologetic. "For old times," she said. I accepted it because community thrives on gestures, even clumsy ones. I told her I forgave the past, but that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. She nodded, and for a while we both pretended that was enough. Not everyone agreed with what we did. A few people thought a trap was an overreaction. "You should have called the police," one neighbor said. Another suggested mediation. I listened because I wanted to. The neighborhood was a patchwork of opinions and most of us were learning to live together again. Eventually we accepted that there are many ways to correct a wrong, and most of them leave leftover feelings that need tending. When the local paper picked up a short human interest piece about the HOA shake-up, I braced for embarrassment. Instead, a surprising theme emerged in the letters to the editor. People writing about feeling overlooked, about small thefts of attention and dignity. "We never thought someone's petty habits could make you feel invisible," one reader wrote. The story, modest as it was, became a mirror. It reflected not only Karen's behavior but a broader acceptance that civility needs reinforcement. The thing about community is that it requires maintenance. If you ignore the squeaky hinge, it doesn't mean the door will keep opening smoothly forever. It only means that eventually the hinges will give and someone will get stuck on the wrong side. What the trap did was force a hinge to squeak loudly enough for people to notice. I kept thinking about how often we mistake loudness for leadership. There are people who command rooms because they shout, not because they listen. And then, there are people who act quietly and with care whose work never ends up in minutes or official reports. The trap was a small act of reclamation for those quiet people, a reminder that their lives matter, too. Years pass, and the memory of that season becomes a story people tell on summer barbecues, the kind of anecdote that makes neighbors laugh and nod because they all know an equivalent character in their own lives. "Which one of you put a trap in the mailbox?" someone would ask half-jokingly. I would smile and say it was a team effort, which was true in a sense. Sometimes it takes a few people willing to stand up to make a difference. I never asked to be the protagonist of that story. I didn't want attention. I wanted male dignity and the assumption that the neighborhood would follow the rules it claimed to hold dear. In the process, I learned more about human temperament than I ever expected. Anger that compels you to act, shame that can reform a person if it's met with fairness, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust. If there was one lesson that outlived the moment, it was this: small, firm boundaries matter. They protect the ordinary miracles of daily life. Letters from loved ones, packages that mean a small business owner's survival, a child's birthday present arriving on time. When someone reaches into your life and takes that thing because it feels convenient, they steal more than paper. They steal certainty. So if you hear a story about a mailbox and a snap, remember to listen for what lies underneath it. A call for fairness, for respect, and for neighbors to look out for each other. The trap itself was a simple thing. The change it triggered was human and slow and necessary, and it started, oddly enough, with a single sharp sound that made the whole street wake.